Hello there, and welcome back to the Sleepy Nova Chronicles. Somewhere beneath the streets of Rome, water is still moving. Not in a modern pipe. Not through any system installed in the last 500 years. In channels that were carved into the bedrock and lined with hydraulic cement by Roman engineers more than 2,000 years ago. Channels that have been carrying water continuously, without interruption, without maintenance in the modern sense. Simply because the gradient the original builders chose was precise enough, and the materials they used were durable enough that the water still finds the same path it found when Augustus Caesar was emperor, and the city it was built to serve held 1,000,000 people and was the largest, most complex, most water-hungry urban organism the ancient world had ever produced. The water does not know it is ancient. It is simply obeying gravity. Following the slope, the specific, calculated, extraordinarily precise slope that the Roman engineers established across distances of tens and sometimes hundreds of kilometers, measuring the gradient not with lasers or satellites or the digital levels of modern surveying, but with an instrument called a chorobates, a long wooden beam fitted with a water level, essentially a carpenter's level scaled up to 2 meters in length, and with a device called a groma, a surveying cross mounted on a pole that allowed sight lines to be established across rough terrain. These instruments are so simple that a reasonably competent craftsperson could build them in a day from materials available in any well-stocked workshop. With these tools alone, the Roman engineers surveyed and built the most sophisticated hydraulic infrastructure the ancient world would ever see. The Aqua Claudia, one of the 11 major aqueducts that served the city of Rome, stretched for approximately 69 kilometers from its source in the Anio Valley east of the city to the distribution points in Rome itself. 69 kilometers of covered channel, stone and concrete and tile, carrying approximately 300,000 cubic meters of water per day, enough to fill approximately 120 Olympic swimming pools, every day, continuously, for the 400 years that the aqueduct was in full operation. 120 Olympic swimming pools. Every day, through a channel that no pump drove, that no engine powered, that moved its water by nothing more than the patient, continuous, inexhaustible force of gravity acting on a liquid surface tilted at a gradient of approximately half a meter per kilometer. Half a meter per kilometer. That is the gradient of the Aqua Claudia. The slope that the Roman engineers established across 69 kilometers of hills and valleys and ravines and the soft volcanic tufa of the Alban Hills, a slope so gentle that walking across it you would feel nothing, would notice nothing unusual about the ground beneath your feet, would have no sensory impression of being on an incline at all. And yet that imperceptible slope was enough. Enough for gravity to drive 300,000 cubic meters of water from a spring in the hills to the heart of the city, reliably, every day, for 400 years. The Romans understood something about water that most people today never need to know. That water does not require force. It requires direction. Give water the slightest consistent downward path, and it will move itself, endlessly, with no energy input beyond the initial energy spent establishing the slope. The water does the work. The engineer's job is simply to give it the right direction and then stay out of the way. This is the first thing to understand about Roman aqueducts, and the thing that makes them, once you grasp it fully, one of the most calming achievements in the history of human engineering. Not because they are gentle. They are not gentle. They are massive, expensive, extraordinarily precise pieces of infrastructure that required decades to build and armies of workers to construct. But because the principle they operate on is the most patient principle in physics. Gravity. The force that never hurries, never flags, never requires maintenance or fuel or any input from the human beings it serves. The force that has been pulling water downhill since the first rain fell on the first mountain, and that will continue pulling water downhill long after every aqueduct ever built has crumbled to dust. The aqueduct did not fight gravity. It listened to it. And in listening to it, in giving gravity exactly the channel it needed to move water from the hills to the city without waste, without turbulence, without any energy expenditure beyond the potential energy locked in the elevation difference between the source and the destination, the The Roman engineers built something that outlasted the empire that ordered it, the engineers who designed it, and most of the city it was built to serve. It is still there. The water is still moving. The misconception to release tonight is the idea that Roman engineering was impressive because it was powerful, because it used force, because it imposed the human will on an unyielding landscape through brute effort and massive scale. That is part of the story. The aqueducts were built by enormous numbers of workers over decades, and the labor they required was immense. But the deeper achievement, the thing that makes the aqueducts worth spending a quiet hour thinking about at the end of a long day, is not the force. It is the precision, the patience, the willingness to survey the land with painstaking care, to calculate the gradient with instruments of extraordinary simplicity, to choose the path of least resistance, and then follow it with the disciplined consistency of people who understood that water would do the work if they gave it the right conditions. You are part of the lineage that built these systems, not genetically, or not necessarily, but culturally, intellectually, practically. The water that comes from your tap tonight travels through a system that descends directly, in its engineering principles and its material technologies and its understanding of hydraulics, from the Roman aqueduct tradition. The gradient calculations, the pipe sizing, the pressure management, the settlement tanks, all of it traces back, through 2,000 years of refinement and improvement, to the engineers who walked the hills outside Rome with their chorobates and their grommers and their patient, systematic understanding of what water needs to flow. Tonight we are going to follow the water, from the spring in the hills where the Roman surveyor first measured the gradient, through the 69 kilometers of covered channel that the workforce spent decades constructing, through the distribution system that carried water to every neighborhood of a city of 1 million people, through the baths and the fountains and the private households and the industries that the water fed, to the place where all of it arrives in you, in the water your body contains, in the hydraulic principles that your own cardiovascular system runs on, in the specific, ancient, gravity-driven logic of a fluid moving along a gradient toward wherever it is needed most. If this quiet journey through the infrastructure of the ancient world is useful to you tonight, a slow hour of Roman engineering and the patient physics of water moving downhill, then I would gently invite you to subscribe, or to leave a thought below about which part of this stays with you. It helps other people who are lying in their own darkness above their own ancient water systems, also following the gradient toward rest, find their way here, 1 cubic meter at a time. But for now, there is only this. Allow your shoulders to soften. Let your breathing slow, not pushed toward any particular rhythm, just allowed to find the pace it finds when the body is still and the mind has stopped fighting the direction that gravity is always suggesting anyway. Downward, into the surface beneath you, into the specific, patient, effortless rest that the body finds when it stops resisting what physics has always been recommending. Water does not resist the gradient. It follows it. Follow it now. Let's begin. Rome was thirsty in a way that no city before it had ever been. Not thirsty in the sense of inadequate. Not thirsty in the way that a desert settlement is thirsty, scratching for survival at the margin of what the land can provide. Thirsty in the way that a machine is thirsty for the fuel that makes it run. Rome at its peak, in the 1st and 2nd centuries of the Common Era, when the city held between 800,000 and 1 million people, consumed water at a rate that was, and has never been equaled by any pre-industrial city in history, approximately 1 million cubic meters per day. 1 million cubic meters per day. The entire flow of the Thames through London on an average day is approximately 1 million cubic meters. Rome's daily water consumption matched the daily flow of the Thames, not through one aqueduct, but through 11 major aqueduct systems, each one carrying water from a different source in the hills around the city, each one supplying a different distribution zone, the whole network delivering water to every neighborhood of the city through approximately 800 kilometers of channel and pipe. 800 kilometers of hydraulic infrastructure, supplying 1 million people. 2,000 years ago. To understand what this meant in practice, what it felt like to live in a city supplied by this system. You need to hold two numbers simultaneously. The first is the volume, 1 million cubic meters per day, delivered by gravity alone, from springs and rivers in the hills surrounding the city, through channels that descended at their careful, imperceptible gradients toward the city's distribution points. The second is the distribution. The water that arrived at those distribution points did not simply pool in reservoirs and wait for people to come and collect it. It flowed continuously, under constant pressure maintained by the elevation of the distribution tanks, the castellum divisorium, the dividing castles, the stone tanks at the ends of the aqueduct channels where the water was divided between the three categories of distribution the Roman system maintained: public, commercial, private, in that order of priority. The public fountains, the lacus, the stone basins placed at street corners throughout the city, were the first recipients of the water that arrived at the castellum. They received water at all times, under all conditions. Even when the supply was reduced by drought or maintenance, the public fountains ran, because the public fountain was not a luxury. It was the source of drinking water for the majority of Rome's population, who had no private water connection, who carried their water home in jugs from the nearest lacus, who lived within 100 meters of a fountain anywhere in the city because the density of the distribution network, approximately one fountain per 150 to 200 meters throughout the urban area, made access universal. The second priority was commercial. The baths, the fooleries, the markets, the industries that required water continuously for their operation. The third, and only after the public supply and the commercial supply were satisfied, was the private household connections of the wealthy, who paid for the privilege of having water delivered directly to their homes, and who received it not as a guaranteed supply but as the overflow from the public and commercial systems. When the water ran short, the private supply was the first to be reduced. The poor got their water first. The rich got the remainder. This is the most consistently surprising fact about the Roman water distribution system for modern audiences. The inversion of the priority order that most people assume would have prevailed in an ancient slave-owning society where wealth determined access to everything. The Roman water engineers did not build a system that served the wealthy first. They built a system that served the city first, that prioritized the basic water needs of the entire urban population over the comfort of those who could afford to pay for extra. Not out of egalitarian principle in the modern sense. Out of practical engineering logic. A city of 1 million people cannot function if the majority of its population cannot access clean water. Disease, fire, civil unrest. All of these threats to the city's stability and productivity were mitigated by the guarantee of public water supply. The lacus at the street corner was not a charity. It was infrastructure. It was the minimum provision without which the city ceased to work. The monster of Roman hydraulic engineering is not the arch of the Pont du Gard, or the beryl vault of the Aqua Claudia, or the sheer labor of cutting 69 kilometers of channel through the volcanic rock of the Alban Hills. The monster is the system, the integrated, hierarchically organized, metrologically sophisticated system of supply and distribution that managed 1 million cubic meters of water per day across 800 kilometers of infrastructure with no pumps, no computers, no pressure gauges, no digital sensors of any kind, with lead pipes, stone channels, and gravity alone, and with the specific, quantitative, empirically derived understanding of fluid hydraulics that the Roman engineers had developed through 2 centuries of aqueduct construction before the system reached its mature form. Detectives looking at the surviving Roman engineering manuals, particularly the De Aqueductu Urbis Romi, written by Sextus Julius Frontinus, the Curator Aquarum or Water Commissioner of Rome, in approximately 97 CE, revealed a level of hydraulic engineering knowledge that was, for its time, without parallel anywhere in the ancient world. Frontinus documented the dimensions of every pipe diameter in use in the Roman system, the flow rate through each pipe size, the method for calculating the volume delivered by each aqueduct, the regulations governing private connections, the penalties for tapping the supply illegally, and the specific inspection schedule maintained for every major channel in the network. Frontinus was not an engineer by training. He was a senator and a military commander who was appointed water commissioner and educated himself in the details of the infrastructure he was responsible for managing. His manual is the product of that self-education, the record of a bureaucrat who took his responsibilities seriously enough to understand them in quantitative detail. He documented that at the time of writing, Rome's 11 aqueducts delivered a combined daily flow of approximately 1 million cubic meters, a figure that he derived by measuring the dimensions of each channel and calculating the flow rate from the gradient and the cross-sectional area. Volume equals cross-sectional area times velocity. Velocity derives from the gradient through the hydraulic equations that Frontinus applied. The calculation is not conceptually different from the one that your water utility company performs today, when it calculates the flow rate through its distribution network. The mathematics has been refined and the instruments used to measure the input variables are more precise. But the underlying hydraulic principles, the relationship between pipe diameter, flow velocity, and delivered volume, are the same principles that Frontinus was applying in 97 CE with a stylus and a wax tablet. The Roman water commissioner and your water utility company are solving the same equations. 2,000 years apart. Your body is solving the same equations too. Your cardiovascular system, the network of arteries and veins and capillaries that distributes blood from the heart to every tissue in your body, operates on hydraulic principles that are structurally identical to the principles of the Roman aqueduct system. The heart is the elevated reservoir, the source of pressure that drives the fluid through the network. The aorta is the main channel, the large diameter primary conduit that carries the bulk flow from the source. The arteries are the secondary channels, progressively smaller in diameter as they branch, delivering flow to progressively smaller distribution zones. The capillaries are the lacus, the final delivery points, the places where the fluid reaches its ultimate destination and makes contact with the tissue that needs it. And the flow through each vessel is governed by exactly the same hydraulic relationship that governs the flow through each Roman pipe. Flow equals pressure divided by resistance, where resistance is determined by the length of the vessel and its diameter. A narrow capillary resisting flow more than a wide artery in exactly the proportion predicted by the same equations that Frontinus applied to his pipe diameter tables. Your body is an aqueduct. Your heart is the spring in the hills. Your capillaries are the lacus at the street corner, and the blood circulating through you right now, carrying its oxygen and its nutrients and its waste products through the same hierarchical, branching, pressure-driven distribution network that the Roman water engineers independently reinvented in stone and lead, is following the same gradient logic as the water in the Aqua Claudia. Pressure differential, resistance, flow. The physics does not change across 2,000 years. Now consider the scale of the individual aqueduct, not the system as a whole, but the specific, physical, material reality of a single channel carrying water across a landscape. The Aqua Claudia, whose 69-kilometer course from source to Rome we began with, runs for the majority of its length underground, tunneled through the volcanic rock of the hillsides in covered channels that protect the water from contamination and evaporation. The underground sections are invisible from the surface. They run in the dark beneath the Italian countryside, their water moving in the specific, enclosed, lightless quiet of a stone channel 2,000 years old, carrying the same water from the same springs that fed them when Claudius ordered their construction in approximately 38 CE. But where the Aqua Claudia meets a valley, where the terrain drops away below the level of the channel and the underground route is no longer available, the Romans built arches. Not because the arch was the only structural solution to the problem. Because the arch was the most efficient structural solution the Romans had available, a form that converts the compressive load of the structure above it into thrust at the supports, requiring no tensile strength in the material and therefore achievable in stone and concrete without the need for iron reinforcement. The arch allowed the Romans to build tall, strong, load-bearing structures from a material, Roman concrete, Pozzolana-based, extraordinarily durable, that they had in abundance and that they had mastered with a consistency unmatched by any other ancient construction tradition. The aqueduct arches that are still standing in Rome and across the former Roman world, the Pont du Gard in southern France, the Segovia Aqueduct in Spain, the arches of the Aqua Claudia, visible from the Via Appia outside Rome, are not simply supports for a water channel. They are the visible expression of a structural logic so sound that 20 centuries of weather and earthquake and neglect have not been sufficient to bring them down. The Pont du Gard, the three-tier aqueduct bridge that carries the Nîmes aqueduct across the Gardon River in what is now southern France, stands 49 meters above the river it spans. 49 meters! The height of a 16-story building. Built without mortar, the stones of its lower tiers fitted together by precision cutting and the weight of the structure above them, held in place by nothing but the geometry of the arch and the quality of the stone. No mortar, no cement, no adhesive of any kind in the principal structural elements. No mortar, and it is still standing, after 20 centuries. The largest stone blocks in the Pont du Gard weigh approximately 6 tons each, approximately the weight of an African bull elephant. They were cut in a quarry approximately 5 kilometers from the construction site and transported to position by a combination of ox-drawn sledges, river transport, and the wooden cranes and capstans that Roman construction teams used to lift heavy loads. The entire structure was built by approximately 1,000 workers over approximately 3 to 5 years, a rate of construction that, given the tools available and the precision required, engineering historians describe consistently as remarkable. 1,000 workers. 5 years. No mortar. Still standing after 20 centuries. The water channel at the top of the Pont du Gard is approximately 1 meter wide and 1.5 meters tall, just large enough for a man to walk through, bent at the waist. The Roman maintenance workers who inspected the channel from the inside would have walked through that space in the torchlight, stooped and slow, listening to the water moving beside them, checking the concrete lining for cracks and the calcite deposits for blockages, performing the specific, careful, enclosed, underground inspection that kept the channel running for the decades and centuries of its operational life. In the dark, in the close stone passage, with the water moving beside them, their torchlight casting moving shadows on the calcite-coated walls. Detectives looking at the calcite deposits inside surviving aqueduct channels revealed something that converts the inside of a Roman water channel into a geological archive. As the calcium-rich water flowed through the channel over centuries of continuous use, it deposited calcium carbonate on the channel walls and floor. The same chemical process that forms stalactites in caves, the same mineral that forms the scale in a modern kettle. These calcite deposits, accumulating at rates of approximately 1 to 3 millimeters per year depending on the water chemistry, built up layers inside the channel that preserve, in their chemical composition and their isotopic ratios, a record of the water source, its temperature, and the conditions in the channel at every stage of the deposit's growth. The inside of a Roman aqueduct is a 2,000-year climate record, sealed in calcium carbonate, in the dark, waiting for the detective with the right instruments to read it. And those detectives have read it, have extracted climate records from the calcite deposits of the Anio Novus and the Aqua Claudia and the aqueducts of southern France that describe the rainfall patterns and the spring discharge rates and the temperature variations of the Roman period with a precision that no written historical record could provide. The aqueduct did not only carry water, it recorded the climate of the world it operated in, layer by layer, in the mineral record of its own use. The channel remembers every year of its operation. In stone, in the dark. Your own bones do the same thing, accumulating mineral over the years of your life in layers that carry, in their chemistry, the record of the conditions you lived in. The calcium in your bones was deposited over time, at rates that varied with your nutrition and your activity and the specific conditions of your biology at each stage of growth. The mineral record of your bones is a geological archive of your life, less precise than the calcite archive of the aqueduct, less readable with current technology, but present. Chemical. Real. You carry your own climate record in your skeleton, as the aqueduct carries its in the calcium carbonate of 2,000 years of flowing water. Both archives in the dark, both recording the conditions of their operation. both patient, both still here. When the water arrived in Rome, it did not simply stop. It transformed. The same water that had spent hours or days moving through 60 or 90 kilometers of stone channel in the dark, following its gradient with the patient efficiency of gravity, emerged at the Castellum Divisorium and entered a city that had organized its entire social life around the fact of its presence. Not adapted to the water, organized around it. The specific rhythms and routines and social spaces of Roman urban life were structured by the availability of continuously flowing, publicly accessible fresh water in a way that no ancient city before Rome and no medieval city after it could replicate. The bath was the center of Roman social life, not the forum, despite its political importance, not the theater or the amphitheater, despite their entertainment value. The bath, the thermae, the enormous public bathing complex that the aqueducts made possible, was the place where every Roman citizen, regardless of wealth or status, spent several hours of every day. Where they went after work, before dinner, with friends, with strangers, in the specific social environment of the communal bath that had no parallel in any other culture and that produced, as a social institution, something that the Roman world was uniquely able to sustain: a democracy of cleanliness. The baths of Caracalla, built between 212 and 216 CE, covering approximately 27 hectares and capable of accommodating approximately 8,000 bathers simultaneously, was supplied by their own dedicated branch of the Aqua Marcia and the Aqua Antoniniana, an aqueduct extension built specifically for the baths. The complex contained not only the bathing rooms, the frigidarium, the cold room, the tepidarium, the warm room, the caldarium, the hot room, but libraries, exercise halls, gardens, shops, and the specific social spaces that turned a visit to the baths from a hygiene routine into a daily cultural event. 8,000 people, simultaneously, bathing together, in rooms whose vaulted ceilings rose 33 meters above the floor, the height of an 11-story building, decorated with marble and mosaic and the specific, overwhelming visual richness that the Romans deployed in their public spaces as a statement about the power and the civilization of the state that built them. All of it fed by water arriving at a gradient of 0.5 meter per kilometer, from springs in hills 30 kilometers away, through channels that nobody currently living had built and nobody currently living could have built. Simply flowing. The social institution of the Roman bath is the most direct expression of what the aqueduct system made possible, not just the technical fact of water availability, but the specific transformation of that technical fact into a cultural practice that defined Roman urban identity for centuries. The Romans did not simply use water. They celebrated it. They built the most elaborate and the most beautiful water distribution structures the ancient world had ever seen, not because elaborate and beautiful was more functional than simple and plain, but because the water deserved the architecture it received. Because the water was the most important thing the city had. Detectives looking at the social structure of the Roman baths using the written accounts of bathers. Seneca, who famously complained about the noise from the baths in the apartment building above which he lived, and whose descriptions of the specific sounds and social interactions of bathing life provide the most vivid first-hand account available, revealed something about the Roman bath as a social institution that no physical evidence of the architecture alone could convey. The bath was egalitarian in a way that Roman society, notoriously hierarchical in almost every other context, was not. In the bath, senators and slaves bathed in the same water, not in the same room. The private suite and the public hall existed side by side, and the wealthy had access to more comfortable facilities. But in the same building, under the same vaulted ceiling, fed by the same aqueduct, on the same afternoon. The bath was the one social space where the specific, physical, unavoidable fact of shared human embodiment, the same water, the same steam, the same sweat, asserted itself against the rigid stratifications of Roman social order. Everyone was dirty before they bathed. Everyone was clean afterward. The water made them equal for the duration. Your own experience of water, the specific, familiar, deeply personal relationship with water that constitutes the entirety of your practical hydraulic experience, descends from this tradition. Not in any direct cultural lineage, not through any chain of specific practices transmitted from Roman society to your own, but in the specific technology. The pipe that brings water to your tap is a Roman invention, maintained by Roman-derived engineering principles, operating on Roman-derived hydraulic mathematics. The municipal water system that your city maintains, the reservoir, the treatment plant, the distribution network, the pressure management infrastructure, is the direct descendant of the Roman aqueduct system, simplified and miniaturized and made available to every household rather than only to the fortunate few, but built on the same fundamental engineering logic. The water in your glass tonight followed a gradient. From its source, a reservoir, a river intake, a groundwater extraction point, through the treatment plant, through the distribution network, through the pipe in your wall, through the tap, into the glass, into you. Gravity most of the way. Pump assisted where necessary. But gravity most of the way. As it was in the Aqua Claudia. As it has always been. Now follow the water to where it went in Rome after the bath. To the destination that the Roman water system produced in such extraordinary abundance that historians of ancient Rome have spent decades trying to account for what happened to it all. The fountains. Rome had approximately 1,300 public fountains. The lacus, the small stone basins at street corners that we encountered in Movement 2, and an additional number of decorative fountains, large sculptural water features placed in public squares and gardens, and the forecourts of temples and public buildings, whose function was not primarily practical but aesthetic and psychological. Aesthetic and psychological. The Romans understood, with a specific practical intelligence that characterizes their engineering tradition at its best, that water is not only a physical resource. It is a sensory experience. The sound of moving water, the specific, irregular, white noise-like acoustic quality of water falling into a basin or running over a weir, produces a measurable effect on the human nervous system that the Romans had not studied neurologically, but had understood experientially for long enough to incorporate into their urban design as deliberately as they incorporated shade and seating and the specific spatial proportions that make a public square comfortable to inhabit. The decorative fountain was not a luxury. It was infrastructure for well-being. The neurological response to moving water sounds that we encountered in the slow river script, the parasympathetic activation, the cortisol reduction, the automatic downregulation of the arousal systems, was understood by Roman urban planners not as a neurological mechanism but as a fact of daily experience. Public spaces with water sound were calmer, more pleasant, more conducive to the social interaction that the forum and the market and the public square were designed to facilitate. The fountain made the city work better by making its people calmer. Detectives looking at the acoustic design of Roman public spaces using spatial audio modeling and the surviving physical dimensions of Roman forums and fountain installations revealed that the Roman urban designers made specific, deliberate choices about the placement and the scale of water features that cannot be explained by purely practical considerations. The nymphaeum, the elaborate, semicircular, architecturally ornamented water feature that was a standard element of Roman public space design, was positioned at the focal point of sightlines within the space, its sound designed to reach the maximum number of people within the public area, its acoustic contribution to the ambient soundscape of the space calculated, not explicitly, not mathematically, but through the accumulated experiential knowledge of what worked, to provide the specific quality of background sound that made the space feel right. The Romans engineered calm into the public spaces of their cities, using water and stone and the patient physics of a liquid falling from one level to another. The sound of a Roman fountain in the 2nd century CE, in the nymphaeum of the Forum of Nerva, or the cascading pools of Hadrian's Villa at Tivoli, or the continuous overflow of the Lacus at the corner of any street in any neighborhood of the city, is as close as we can come, without a time machine, to experiencing the specific sensory environment of Roman urban life. Not the smell, not the sight, not the social complexity of a million people in dense proximity. Just the sound. Water falling. Continuously. in the city that never ran dry. Your body is responding to the thought of that sound right now, not to the sound itself. You cannot hear a Roman fountain from wherever you are lying in the dark, but to the representation of it in language, which activates, in the auditory cortex and in the neural systems associated with the particular acoustic quality of moving water, something close enough to the response to the actual sound that the physiological effect is measurable even in the absence of the physical stimulus. The brain that hears water falling continuously produces a neural response similar to the brain that hears water falling continuously. Because the neural representation of water sound is the same system that processes water sound, the same cortical and subcortical machinery, activated by the linguistic representation rather than the acoustic one, producing a similar but attenuated version of the same parasympathetic shift. You are being calmed by the description of a fountain, as the Roman citizen was calmed by the fountain itself. The same neural machinery. 2,000 years apart. The Roman city slept well. Not because the Romans were less anxious than modern people. The historical record suggests they were not. That Roman urban life was as dense with social competition and economic anxiety and political uncertainty as any modern urban environment. But because their cities were engineered, at every level of their design, to provide the sensory conditions that human nervous systems need to down-regulate from the demands of urban social life. The baths provided heat and water and physical relaxation, and the specific parasympathetic shift of sustained warm water immersion. The fountains provided continuous moving water sound and the specific cortisol reduction that ambient water sound reliably produces. The gardens, the horti, the private and public green spaces that Roman urban planning incorporated into the city at every scale from the window box to the imperial garden complex, provided shade and green space and the specific restorative attention of a natural environment that psychologists now call attention restoration theory, and that the Romans knew by no theory at all, but by the persistent experience of every urban citizen who had ever spent time in a garden and felt better for it. The Romans built the infrastructure of calm into their cities as deliberately as they built the infrastructure of water, knowing, through accumulated civic experience rather than neuroscientific measurement, that a city whose citizens could find water and shade and rest and the sound of moving water would be a city that functioned better, thought more clearly, produced more, argued less, and survived longer than a city that provided none of these things. They were right. Rome lasted, as a functioning urban organism of the first order, for approximately 5 centuries after the completion of the aqueduct system. 5 centuries of urban civilization supported by water infrastructure. 5 centuries of the specific social practices, the bath, the fountain, the nymphaeum, the garden, that the aqueduct made possible and that defined the character of Roman urban life at its most distinctive. And when the water stopped, when the aqueducts were cut and the city's water supply was interrupted for the first time in 5 centuries, everything that the water had sustained began, almost immediately, to collapse. The bath closed first. The city emptied next. In 537 CE, the Ostrogothic general Vitiges besieged Rome. His army, encamped in the fields outside the Aurelian Wall, did what every competent military commander who understood Roman infrastructure understood was the most effective possible attack on a city that could not be taken by direct assault. He did not try to breach the walls. He did not attempt a direct frontal attack on a garrison that was defending prepared positions. He cut the aqueducts. One by one, across the hills east and southeast of the city, the channels of the Roman water system were severed. The Aqua Claudia, the Aqua Annio Novus, the Aqua Marcia, the channels that had been carrying water continuously to Rome for 4, 5, 6 centuries, channels that had outlasted the dynasties that built them, the emperors who had celebrated them, the engineers who had surveyed them, were broken. The water stopped. Within days, the consequences were felt across every level of the city's functioning. The public fountains, the lacus that had run continuously for centuries, the street corner basins that had provided drinking water to the entire urban population, ran dry. The baths closed. The workshops that depended on the water supply for their operations shut down. The drainage systems that used the constant flow of water to flush the city's waste through the sewers, the Cloaca Maxima and its tributaries, the largest and most sophisticated urban drainage system the ancient world had produced, began to fail. The city that had been sustained by the continuous flow of 1 million cubic meters of water per day was now sustained by whatever the Tiber River and the city's wells could provide. And the Tiber, polluted by the waste that the drainage system was no longer flushing away, and the wells, drawing from a water table that had been altered by centuries of intensive use, could not provide what the city needed. The population of Rome, which had stood at approximately 1 million at the city's peak, had already been declining for the previous century as the political and economic conditions that had made the city viable were themselves deteriorating. The siege of 537 CE did not kill Rome, but the cutting of the aqueducts accelerated the decline that was already underway in a way that the city's remaining infrastructure could not compensate for. By the end of the 6th century, the population of Rome had fallen to approximately 30,000 people, from 1 million to 30,000 in approximately 150 years. The decline in population was not primarily the result of violence, though violence played a role. It was the result of the progressive failure of the infrastructure that had made a city of 1 million people possible in the first place. Water, food distribution, sanitation, the complex, interdependent systems that urban life requires, and that the collapse of the political and economic order that had maintained them could no longer sustain. The city did not die when the water stopped, but it stopped being what it had been. The specific, concrete, irreversible demonstration that water is not simply a resource that a city uses but the medium through which a city of any significant size is possible at all. This is the lesson of Rome's post-aqueduct decline. Not that Rome was uniquely vulnerable to the loss of its water supply. That every large city is. That the specific density of human population that constitutes a city requires a per capita water supply that cannot be provided from local wells and rain collection, that requires engineered delivery of water from distant sources, that requires maintenance and political will and the sustained investment of labor and capital that only a functioning state can provide. The monster of the aqueduct's history is not the engineering scale of the system. It is the function it performed for the city, the irreplaceable, civilization-sustaining, population-enabling function of delivering clean water to 1 million people continuously, day after day, year after year, for 5 centuries. And the catastrophe is not the cutting of the channels by vitages. The catastrophe is the 500-year civilizational investment, the accumulated labor of generations of workers, the accumulated knowledge of generations of engineers, the accumulated political will of generations of administrators, that those cuts destroyed in weeks. 500 years of infrastructure, destroyed in weeks. The Roman water system did not fail because the engineering was flawed. The Pont du Gard still stands. The calcite-lined channels of the Aqua Claudia are still intact in many places. The hydraulic concrete that the Romans mixed from volcanic pozzolana and seawater has, in many cases, proved more durable than modern Portland cement. Detectives looking at the chemistry of Roman marine concrete structures revealed that they actually strengthen over time as the volcanic minerals in the mix continue reacting with seawater, forming new crystal structures that fill microfractures and increase the concrete's resistance to failure. The engineering did not fail. The political will to maintain it failed. The system required maintenance, not constant, dramatic, expensive maintenance, but the specific, ongoing, attentive maintenance of a complex infrastructure whose components degrade gradually and require periodic inspection and repair to remain functional. The calcite deposits that accumulate inside the channels at 1 to 3 millimeters per year reduce the channel's cross-section over decades, requiring periodic removal. The sections of channel exposed to freeze-thaw cycles develop cracking in the concrete lining that requires sealing before the damage propagates. The distribution pipes develop blockages. The settling tanks fill with sediment. None of these maintenance requirements are insurmountable. The Roman water administration, the office of the curator aquarum, the department that Frontinus managed and documented, maintained a workforce of approximately 700 slaves dedicated to the inspection, maintenance, and repair of the aqueduct system. 700 people, full-time, doing nothing but keeping the channels running. That is the specific human investment that the system required to remain operational. When the political organization that maintained that workforce dissolved, the maintenance stopped. And without maintenance, the most durable engineered system in the ancient world became, over the centuries that followed, a monument rather than a machine. The pipes silted up. The channels cracked. The settling tanks filled. The calcite deposits thickened until they reduced the channel to a fraction of its original capacity. And the water supply that had fed 1 million people dwindled, not through a single catastrophic failure, but through the slow accumulation of unmaintained degradation that eventually reduced the Roman aqueduct system from the most sophisticated water delivery network the ancient world had produced to the ruins that stand in the Italian countryside today. Detectives looking at the archaeological record of Rome in the early medieval period, the 4 centuries between the cutting of the aqueducts and the first serious medieval attempts at restoration, revealed a city that had not simply lost its water infrastructure. It had reorganized its entire spatial structure around the new constraints. The population that remained, the 30 to 50,000 people who inhabited the city in the 7th and 8th centuries, concentrated in the areas nearest the Tiber, where river water was accessible. The hilltop neighborhoods that had been densely populated when the aqueducts supplied them, the Aventine, the Esquiline, the Celian, were largely abandoned, their grand buildings left to the slow work of vegetation and gravity and the scavenging of building materials by later generations. The city descended to the river, toward the water, as water always descends, not by choice, not by plan, but by the simple logic of going where the available gradient leads. Your own life reorganizes itself the same way when a system it depends on is no longer maintained. The relationships that require attention and investment to remain functional gradually simplify when the investment stops. The skills that require practice to remain sharp dull when the practice is interrupted. The specific capacities, physical, cognitive, emotional, that are built and maintained through sustained effort degrade when the effort is withdrawn. Not immediately, not dramatically, gradually. 1 millimeter per year of calcite. One small crack in the lining that grows through the freeze-thaw of a winter. One section of the channel that fills with sediment and is not cleared, until the capacity is reduced by enough that the system that depends on it begins, in ways not immediately visible from any single vantage point, to change. This is the lesson of the Roman aqueduct's decline. Not that great systems inevitably fail. That great systems require maintenance to remain great. That the investment, the 700 workers, the annual inspection schedule, the political will to fund the curator aquarum and his staff, is not separate from the system. It is part of the system. Withdraw the maintenance, and the system begins, slowly, to become something less. But here is where the catastrophe turns. Because the Roman water engineering tradition was not destroyed by the cutting of the aqueducts or the fall of the empire. It was preserved. In the monasteries, the monastic communities that survived and eventually flourished in the power vacuum of the post-Roman Mediterranean inherited, among the many aspects of Roman material culture they absorbed and maintained, the Roman tradition of hydraulic engineering. The monasteries needed water, for drinking, for cooking, for the ritual washing that monastic life required, for the mills that ground the grain, for the fish ponds that provided food on fast days. And the monks who managed the water supply of their communities were, in many cases, working from the same engineering principles. The gradient, the settling tank, the distribution pipe, that Frontinus had documented in 97 CE. The monastic water systems of the early medieval period are, in their basic hydraulic logic, Roman aqueducts in miniature. And when the population of European cities began to grow again in the 11th and 12th centuries, when the recovery of urban life that the medieval expansion of trade and agriculture produced created cities large enough to require engineered water supply, The engineers who built the first post-Roman urban water systems drew on the monastic tradition, which had preserved the Roman hydraulic knowledge through 4 centuries of urban decline. The knowledge did not die. It flowed through the monasteries, as water flows through a channel, following whatever gradient was available, until it reached the city that needed it. Your body maintains its essential functions through the same principle of preserved knowledge flowing through channels that survive interruption. The procedural memory, the deep knowledge of how to perform the skills that define your competence and your identity, survives periods of disuse better than the explicit memories of specific facts and events. The knowledge of how to ride a bicycle, how to swim, how to type, how to navigate a familiar environment. These capacities are stored in neural substrates more durable and more resistant to degradation than the episodic memories of specific experiences. The body preserves its essential knowledge through the channels that matter most, as the monasteries preserved Roman hydraulic knowledge through the centuries that seemed, from inside them, to offer no path back to the civilization that had built the channels. The water is patient. It waits for the gradient to return, and when the gradient returns, it flows. There is Roman water in your body right now. Not literally. Not the specific water molecules that flowed through the Aqua Claudia in the 2nd century CE, which have long since cycled through the ocean and the atmosphere and the bodies of 1,000 generations of organisms before arriving, as rain or as river water or as groundwater, in the reservoir or the aquifer that supplied the treatment plant that pressurized the pipe that filled whatever vessel you last drank from, but in the chemistry, in the specific dissolved minerals that the water carries from its geological source, the calcium and the magnesium and the iron and the silica that characterize the chemistry of water from a specific geological formation and that leave their trace in the water's hardness and taste and in the faint mineral deposits that accumulate in the vessels that hold it. Roman writers noted the taste of the water from different aqueducts. Pliny the Elder described the waters of the Aqua Marcia, drawn from a cool, clear spring in the Anio Valley, famous in antiquity for the quality of its taste and its coldness, as the best water in Rome. Frontinus noted that different aqueducts were preferred for different uses. The Aqua Virgo, whose water was particularly soft, was considered better for bathing than for drinking. The Aqua Marcia's cold, clear water was prized for drinking and cooling wine. The Romans tasted their infrastructure and found it good. The water you drink tonight has a specific taste, a specific mineral signature shaped by the geology of the formation it came from, the treatment process it passed through, the pipes it traveled through to reach you. If you have ever noticed the difference between tap water in different cities, or between tap water and spring water, you have been tasting the geology, the specific mineral content of water from a specific source, shaped by the specific rock formations it passed through on its way from rain to aquifer to treatment plant to your glass. You are tasting the earth, as the Romans tasted theirs, through the water that their engineering had delivered to them. Detectives looking at the chemical composition of the calcite deposits inside Roman aqueduct channels, using mass spectrometry and isotopic analysis to characterize the water chemistry over the full operational period of each channel, revealed that the water quality in the Roman system was, by any standard that can be applied retrospectively, excellent. The sources were spring-fed, cold, naturally filtered through the porous volcanic rock of the Alban Hills, carrying minimal contamination from agricultural or industrial activity at the catchment. The channels were covered, reducing contamination from surface water and biological activity. The settling tanks removed suspended particles before the water entered the distribution system. The Romans were not accidentally producing clean water. They were deliberately producing it, through the specific engineering choices of covered channels, settling tanks, and the selection of spring sources over surface water sources, based on an empirically derived understanding of what made water good that predates any systematic understanding of waterborne pathogens by 18 centuries. They did not know about bacteria. They knew that spring water tasted better, and that people who drank it got sick less often than people who drank from rivers downstream of populated areas. Empirical knowledge without theoretical framework. The right answer for the wrong reason, or rather, for a reason that was, from the available evidence, completely rational. The Romans were as intelligent as we are. They simply lacked the theoretical tools that would have allowed them to explain why their engineering choices were correct. They knew that they were correct because the water was good and the people were healthy and the city functioned. That was enough. And the specific health consequences of the Roman water system, the reduction in the waterborne disease burden that access to clean, continuously flowing water from spring sources produces, are visible in the comparative archaeological record of Roman urban populations versus pre-Roman and post-Roman populations in the same regions. The Roman period shows measurably lower rates of the skeletal pathologies associated with chronic nutritional deficiency and infectious disease than the pre-Roman Iron Age populations of the same regions or the post-Roman medieval populations that inherited the same landscape without the infrastructure. The aqueduct was a public health system, built by engineers who did not know what public health was. Your own body's relationship with water tonight is the direct descendant of this. The clean water system that supplied you today, the treatment plant that removed the pathogens, the distribution network that maintained the pressure, the pipes that delivered the water to your home, is the descendant of the Roman system in its engineering logic and in its public health function. The specific reduction in infectious disease burden that municipal water treatment produces is measurable in the same way that the Roman health benefit was measurable. In the lower mortality rates, the higher life expectancy, the reduced burden of waterborne illness that characterize populations with access to treated water versus populations without it. The water that came out of your tap today made you less likely to be ill tonight, as the aqua marcia made the citizens of Rome less likely to be ill 2,000 years ago. The mechanism is different: chlorination and filtration rather than spring-fed covered channels. The scale is different: billions of people rather than 1 million. The technology is different: digital pressure management and remote monitoring rather than a 700-person maintenance workforce walking the channels by torchlight. But the function is the same: clean water from a distant source, delivered by gravity and pressure, reaching every household, maintaining the specific biochemical environment in the human body that health requires. The biochemical environment. Your body is approximately 60% water. 37 liters of the same compound that the Aqua Claudia carried, the same H2O, the same molecular structure, the same physical properties of specific heat and surface tension and viscosity that the Roman engineers were managing when they calculated their gradients and sized their channels. The water in your cells and your blood and your cerebrospinal fluid is not simply the medium in which your biology operates. It is the operational environment of your biology, the specific chemical context in which every enzyme and every membrane and every ion channel and every protein structure in your body performs its function. The water quality inside your body determines the quality of everything your body does, as the water quality in the Roman distribution system determined the quality of everything the city did. Now follow the gradient to its final destination, the destination that the Roman engineers were ultimately building toward, even if they could not have described it in these terms. The gradient was not an end in itself. The half-meter per kilometer of imperceptible slope that carried the water from the spring in the Anio Valley to the distribution points of Rome was not the achievement. The achievement was what happened when the water arrived. The baths, the fountains, the lacus, the sound of water falling continuously in the public squares. The clean drinking water available to every person in the city regardless of their wealth, or their status, or their position in the rigid hierarchies of Roman social life. The achievement was the city that the water made possible. And the city that the water made possible was, in its water-fed heyday, the largest, most complex, most productive, most culturally sophisticated human settlement the Western world had yet produced. Not because Rome's citizens were more intelligent or more virtuous or more industrious than the citizens of the cities that preceded and followed it. Because they had water. Because the specific, physical, unglamorous, engineering achievement of moving water from a spring to a city through a covered channel on a gradient of half a meter per kilometer had given them the one resource: clean, continuous, universally accessible fresh water, without which the density of human settlement that Rome achieved simply cannot be maintained. The water was the foundation. Everything else was built on it. Your body resting tonight is running the same logic. The water in your cells is the foundation on which every other biological process rests. The medium in which the enzymes catalyze, the ions flow, the membranes function, the proteins fold and unfold in the specific three-dimensional configurations that give them their function. Remove the water, and the proteins denature. Remove the water, and the membranes lose their integrity. Remove the water, and the cells stop working in the specific, ordered, coordinated way that produces the specific, ordered, coordinated phenomenon of a living body. The water is not what your body contains. The water is what your body is. As Rome was not a city that happened to have water. Rome was a city that water made possible. If this journey through the hydraulic history of the ancient world has been useful to you tonight, if this slow hour of Roman engineering and the patient physics of gravity and the sound of water falling continuously in the public squares of a city of 1 million people has helped the day's flow settle into the gradient of tonight's rest, then I would gently invite you to subscribe, or to leave a thought below about which part of this stayed with you longest. Whether it was the half meter per kilometer that moved 300,000 cubic meters per day without a single pump, or the Pont du Gard standing without mortar for 20 centuries, or the 700 workers walking the channels by torchlight, or simply the knowledge that the water in your body tonight is following the same gradient, from the elevated reservoir of your metabolism to the capillary beds of your tissues, that the Roman engineers had understood and built with and celebrated in stone and concrete and the sound of 1,000 fountains 2,000 years ago. It helps other people find their way here, other bodies of water in the dark, also following their gradient toward rest, 1 cubic meter at a time. And if sleep is still arriving slowly, if the day's pressure is still running higher than the night requires, there is another journey waiting, another ancient system, another piece of engineering that outlasted the civilization that built it, told at this same unhurried pace, in this same quiet voice. It will be there when you need it. But for now, feel the weight of your body where it meets the surface beneath you. Feel the specific way that weight is distributed, heavier at the points of greatest contact, lighter where the surface curves away, settling naturally into the configuration that gravity and the surface together determine. Not forced, not arranged, simply finding its level, as water finds its level. You are the water in the channel. You have been flowing all day, following the gradients that the day provided, moving through the specific geography of today's demands, carrying what you were asked to carry, arriving at each destination that the slope of the day indicated. The gradient has changed. The destination is here. The channel ends here. In the Castellum Divisorium of tonight, the distribution point where the day's flow divides into the 3 allocations of rest: the public, the communal, the private, the shared humanity of sleep, the biological maintenance of the body, the specific, quiet, interior restoration of the self that wakes tomorrow. All of it fed by the same gradient, all of it arriving now. Somewhere beneath the streets of Rome, water is still moving, in channels that were carved into the bedrock by Roman engineers more than 2,000 years ago. In the dark, at half a meter per kilometer, carrying whatever small remaining flow still finds its way into the surviving sections of the ancient network, still following the gradient, still obeying the same physics that the Roman engineers understood and harnessed and built into stone and concrete durable enough to still carry water 2,000 years after the empire that ordered it has dissolved into history. The water does not know it is ancient. It is simply obeying gravity. Allow your shoulders to soften now. The way the water surface smooths when the turbulence of the day's flow subsides and the channel is wide enough and the gradient gentle enough that the water moves without disturbance. The surface flat, the flow even, the motion continuous and quiet and exactly as it needs to be. Allow your jaw to unclench. Allow your hands to open. Allow the day's pressure to equalize. The way the pressure in a hydraulic system equalizes when the demand drops and the flow finds its steady state, the turbulence settling out, the surface flattening, the movement becoming the smoothest expression of the gradient that physics allows. Your body is the channel. The gradient is toward rest. The water is already moving. Follow it. Sleep well, and good night.